Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week.
Yes, sir.
What are you bringing to the table today?
So I have brought a toolkit from Interrupting Criminalization to the table for us to talk about today. The toolkit is called Mapping Community Ecosystems of Collective Care, and it was written by Shannon, Perez-Darby, and Andrea Ritchie in collaboration with other folks from Interrupting Criminalization, as well as members of the Creating Collective Ecosystems of Community Care cohort, say that 10 times fast, who through this process of creating this toolkit shared their incredible work, insights, dreams, and lessons learned through their work, which was so great to learn from. And this toolkit also featured lots of amazing insight from so many organizers and organizations engaged in this work from all over the country. So again, there's just so much in this thing to learn from, which is amazing. One of the things shared early on in this toolkit about its purpose, if you will, was why this work is so important. And I think both from the perspective of just a broad sense of safety for all of us, but also from the perspective of the folks in these organizations on the front lines engaged in this work. So they say this, quote, "As communities face increased policing, criminalization, and organized abandonment, mounting state violence, repression, and authoritarianism, escalating white supremacist, homophobic, and transphobic violence, and climate change, building skilled, coordinated, expansive, and robust ecosystems of collective care is only becoming more and more essential to our collective survival. We hope that these shared learnings, processes, and resources will be helpful to communities seeking to strengthen networks of community care and advance transformative justice." And honestly, I couldn't agree more as I went through this and I kept reflecting on that statement. I was like, yes, they've accomplished this with this toolkit. So bravo to the folks behind this. But yeah, this was an incredible toolkit. I'm really excited to chat about it with you today. So let's do it. Where do you want to start? What did you think of it?
Yeah, this is a great resource and a really great dive into the work that the groups in the cohort did to map out the systems of care that exist in their communities.
Yes.
Beyond police and prisons, which turned out to be really hard work for the groups because we're so deeply invested in policing being the only form of intervention that exists that we are aware of, that it's hard to imagine anything beyond it. And in this toolkit, they mentioned that the groups also felt exhausted because of this work.
Right.
And felt they should start addressing the gaps that they were seeing in their communities. So there's just so much. And this resource then dove into something about capacity and accountability and what those things look like in collective movement. And then ended with case studies of how different groups have done the work to build alternatives to policing in their communities and or address issues with care and creating those ecosystems of collective care in response to all that stuff you listed before of rising violence against LGBTQ people and criminalization and organized abandonment, which we've talked about a few times thanks to a lot of brilliant folks who have written about that. So yeah, all of that stuff, and they're all doing the work and mapping out how that's being addressed in their own communities, and also talking about how exhausting that work is to actually map that stuff out and start to build those alternatives, because you're replacing the state in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of things to consider and do, and to actually meet the needs and meet the values that you have for community care. There's a lot of work to do to get there.
I appreciate that idea of like replacing the state and replacing these entrenched systems and structures and ways of being that are not only entrenched in the state and in our communities and in our world, but also in us, right? And you sort of alluded to that too. So yeah, this, your summary there is great because in so many ways, and I think this might be a little insignificant in comparison to all the wisdom shared in this thing, but I think one of the strengths of this toolkit is that it's just so well done, so well put together in the sense of how it's set up, how it's sequenced, right? The way in which it guides you through the ongoing work of these organizations, like to the lessons that they've learned, to the values and principles that should be kept at the center of this work,
Yeah.
to questions to consider. And then certainly, as you said, ending with the case studies. I felt like as I was going through the toolkit, like everything made sense. I was like, okay, yes, I'm ready to do this. Yes, I'm ready to do that every time I flipped through a page. And so it made sense in a lot of ways. And so I just appreciate, that's just a nerdy thing. I just appreciate the way that they put this thing together, and it made a lot of sense to me. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, there's some good curriculum development.
Yeah, I thought about you. I was like, I think Aaron must like this.
Yeah, it was great.
One of the other things that this toolkit did early on that I think situated all of the work shared in it really well was it shared some of the critical questions, and they said used the term conundrums that were present for the cohort, and I think for organizers in general, about how do we enact true public safety measures in the midst of or as a replacement for, really, and it's an alternative to what we've had to live with for so long that hasn't kept any of us safe. And all of it boiled down to these three core questions, and I thought they were great, so I'm going to share them. So the first one was, how do we build shared definitions, values, and practices of safety across neighborhoods and organizations working within a city? The second question was, how do we weave our small, often relatively new community safety projects, ranging from mutual aid formations to transformative justice practitioners, to neighborhood defense organizations, to community fridges, to violence interruption and crisis response teams operating at hyper-local levels, into robust, palpable neighborhood and citywide ecosystems of care that people can feel, trust, and rely on more fully to collectively build greater safety and well-being. That's a whopper. And the last question was, how do we relate to state institutions and resources as we are doing so?
Yeah.
And I love those questions, right?
so good.
I think they help center what's at the core of this work to keep us all and all of our communities truly safe in ways that are sustainable and scalable and grounded in the ways that we need them to be, right?
Yeah, and I think even as we think about scalable, I think it also challenges what scalable means too, where it's not scalable in the sense of, I don't know, the way that we've talked about scalable in the sort of public discourse, so to speak, has always been around tech and like how are you bringing that to scale?
Yeah.
And scale means the masses, as many people as possible. How are you growing your company to be as big as Facebook? And that's not what the goal is here, right? Like the goal is, how are we building things that are sustainable and they're scalable in the way that they're scalable.
Yes.
Right. Like it's not like, oh, you, Damien, are now in charge of crisis intervention for 1 million people.
Right.
And whoever you hire with you. That's just in a lot of ways replicating the systems we already have.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I yes, scalable, and they're also flipping the concept of scalable on its head a little bit.
Yeah, look at you. You've done your homework.
Oh, thank you. I read this thing.
Yes.
So I also wanted to talk about the section on accountability. I mentioned it earlier, but I really appreciated the way they talked about it in here.
Me too.
And the first lesson that really spoke to me was this. Quote, accountability is being responsible to yourself and those around you for your choices and the consequences of those choices. Many of us are under-practiced at meaningful accountability because we've never had the support or modeling of what non-punitive accountability looks like in our everyday lives. Too often, we rush to questions of how we address complex questions of accountability outside the criminal legal system without building a foundation of everyday accountability. And so just like care has been completely taken over by policing and prisons and all of the pieces of those systems, we think about accountability through these punitive lenses too.
Yes.
The punitive lenses of the criminal punishment system. And then so they address that and they talk about that, and we don't have models for how that looks. But then they offer up a model of self-accountability that's from the Accountable Communities Consortium. And they also talk about what to ask ourselves if and when we make a mistake.
Right.
So I'm going to try to mention both of these here and talk about them briefly. So they say self-accountability is, 1, a grounded process we do with and for ourselves 2, it's proactive and you critically think about choices in advance. And 3, it's foundational. It's an essential skill if we want to look at how to take accountability in relationship with others.
Yes.
So all of that is brilliant and gives us something real and
Yeah.
concrete to build an alternative vision of accountability. And then when we do mess up, we can ask ourselves what happened, what was going on for me at the time, and what am I going to do about it now? Which
love
leads
those
us to
questions.
think about,
Yes.
you know, what did I do? What led me to making that choice? What was the context for me to make that choice? And also, how am I going to address what that choice was? What was the impact of that choice? What are all of the circumstances now that I've created maybe with my decision, and how am I going to address those? So both of these things set us up to think critically about what we do, how we're making decisions, but then also what we do once we've made those decisions if the impact is negative or it creates harm. And I think it's a brilliant way for us to think about accountability being part of the self and living in your values and living with integrity in that way. And then thinking about, okay, well, I messed up, so then what do I do next? And they talk about this in the context of the individual, but then also mention how that really scales
Yeah,
in some
there it is.
ways to groups. And so if everybody's practicing this kind of self-accountability, it's easier then for me to come to you and be like, Damien, I noticed that XYZ happened, and you said that you were going to get me this meeting agenda by this date. I think that's an example that
That
you
is an
use in
example in this book. Yeah,
and
in the toolkit.
and then you have an opportunity like, oh yeah, I messed up. It's a way to offer each other a lot of humility in all of our processes of working with one another, both in a proactive way, but
Right.
also reactively when we do mess up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I loved this section a lot. I sat with it a lot, I think, and I sort of took parts of it for myself. One of the things I highlighted for myself was this quote. So they say self-accountability invites us to ask ourselves what happened, what was going on for me at the time, and most importantly, what am I going to do about it? Accountability requires reflection, but most importantly is about action. Apology without changed action is not accountability. I just loved that. I want to print that out. I want to put it on my desk at home and at work, and just constantly be reminded of it. And I think you're right. Like this idea of it being scalable. We all need to be doing this for ourselves and in our interactions with ourselves, but also in our interactions with our circles, our communities, and how scalable that can then be if we're able to successfully figure out, how do I do this for myself? How do I do this with the people that I love and that are close to me? And then how can I do this in my work and with organizations? Like, that is huge. So this section, I think, was so great. And there's lots to learn there. One of the other things that the toolkit discusses in that same section, and you mentioned this, is capacity.
Yeah.
And I thought it was great that they addressed capacity and accountability together, because those things are so connected, especially for organizers and organizations doing this heavy work. This is heavy work. And and you mentioned this earlier, but they talk about how the cohort members shared how exhausted they were, you know, as they engaged in this work to think about what safety resources currently exist and what the needs of their communities are, and how there are often major gaps and significant gaps there. And so I think just that work alone and the recognition of those gaps would totally exhaust me. So I feel that for them, and you know, I totally understand that. But you know, to see that they are not alone in their feelings, but to also have the resources and activities to engage in and to help them do this work with this toolkit, I think is really an incredible piece of this toolkit and a gift of this toolkit, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. I think all of that stuff about accountability and bringing in capacity and having people understand how intrinsically intertwined those things are, as you said, like it's all beautiful gift to people who are doing all kinds of work, but particularly people who are doing this work.
Yeah.
To really challenge and move us toward a place of abolition and collective liberation.
Right. Well, and I also love that, I mean, this toolkit was so transparent in the fact that apparently this cohort, you know, took a break. Like they did a few months of this work and hit kind of a wall, and folks were trying to figure out, like, how can I use this? I don't know what's going to happen. So they went back to their homes and their communities and did some work and put some of the lessons learned into practice, and came back renewed, and like it actually worked. And I learned a lot, and I shared a lot, and and had this, new sense of life in order to continue the work of the exercises and the workshops and all of that. So I just love the transparency of this toolkit as well.
Yeah, the transparency and there's some vulnerability in it too that I thought was great.
Yeah.
And toward the end of the toolkit, they share some lessons about what they learned. And one of the things I wanted to share that stood out to me was in the second lesson about how it takes people, power, and organizational capacity to do this mapping work. Which this is one of those things where it's like, well, yeah, duh. Like it takes capacity, but also it's important to name that and to recognize that because it takes work, and like let's recognize the work that it takes to do to get things done like this.
Yeah.
This work of community mapping and figuring out the ecosystem that you're in around community safety goes beyond just listening what's happening near you, but also how much you're connected to the work of other organizations and what a partnership might look like with those folks and how aligned you are politically. That was one of the things that was interesting too in the Dream Defenders example they talked about.
Yes.
They don't have full political alignment on what a vision looks like in the future with everybody who's involved in their work, the Healing and Justice Center. But they've got alignment around the work that they're doing right now. And that was an important first step for them. So figuring out what your alignment is a huge step. And all of that takes time and effort to ensure that you have clarity about yourself and who you are as an individual, but also an organization.
Right.
But also clarity about who else is in the neighborhood, so to speak.
Yeah.
And at the end of this lesson, the organizers from Interrupting Criminalization say, quote, "We too had to recognize that the work of building an ecosystem to support organizers building ecosystems of community care needed more time and organizational capacity." So you mentioned that the break that they took, that this was a part of that break, is that folks at Interrupting Criminalization realized, oh, we all need a little bit more space. We need a little bit more time to think and reflect. So let's do that.
Yes. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, if you want to build things, you've got to give people real guidance. And that takes a lot of work. That guidance isn't just like throwing together a PowerPoint and saying, here you go.
Yeah.
Asking people to map out these ecosystems is, as we talked about, it's beyond just asking some questions. People have to have time and space to reflect on those different things I mentioned and time to process how this might work for them or what the gaps are. And they talk about, you notice these gaps in the ecosystem of care that you want to see. And so is your organization the right person to fill that gap or are you not? So there's all these pieces, and they talk about all this work and how much work it is. And I think that's just important to name. We're not just throwing things together, which I think addresses some of the concerns that I hear some people talk about when they demonstrate some resistance to abolition, is like, well, it's just going to be some random person who shows up my door. Is like, well, yeah, but they're going to be well trained and they're going to be working in community with other people, and they're going to show up and be concerned about what's going on for you, and they're not going to have a gun.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things between where we are now and that moment in the future. And there's a lot of work to get us there. And they demonstrate a lot of that here. And I've just really appreciated the vulnerability in that, the reflection that they demonstrated. All of those pieces is really great in this whole toolkit.
This whole toolkit. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant segue into application. If that works for you.
Yeah, let's do that.
So if you're new to our show, the application segment of our podcast is where we talk about how this toolkit or whatever it is that we're talking about and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work. And so I spent a lot of time with those lessons learned. So I'm glad you brought that one to the table. And so my application relates to what you were talking about. I think toolkits and resources like this are so important for organizers and organizations engaged in this kind of work, because not only do they provide helpful resources to guide you in the work, but as you said, they remind us that, we need time and space to do it. And so one of the other lessons that they shared in the toolkit was that all of this takes time, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the first one. And then what you shared was the second one. So they say this about that lesson. Mapping and building ecosystems of community care is a process that takes years, even decades. It takes time to build relationships and trust, to experiment with, practice, and refine collaborations, to have challenging conversations, and to navigate inevitable bumps on the road. while the 6-month time frame of the cohort enable us to crystallize important questions and practices to guide the process, it is unrealistic to expect any significant progress to be made within that time frame. And I think that's really important. It's a really important lesson and a great takeaway from all of this for me. This work is big. This work takes time. It involves individual and self-work, like we talked about earlier. And there's so much work that I think all of us can and should do in that area. But this toolkit also served as a great reminder to me that this work of abolition, right? This work of creating ecosystems of community care takes time.
Yeah.
But I know deep down in my heart, with all that we talk about week in and week out on this show, all of the brilliant work that's being done out in the world that we get to talk about here and we get to engage in, I know it's going to be worth it when we get there, but it's going to take time.
Yeah, it's going to take time and a lot of work.
Yeah.
A lot of work.
Yeah.
So much of this work in the toolkit could be application. So many things.
Absolutely.
But I think the concept of mapping ecosystems of care in our communities as individuals, even as a cursory surface level exercise, would be a great way to understand what alternatives you have to calling the police in your community.
Yes.
Like, even if you don't have alternatives to calling the police, thinking through what are the different things that could happen and what kind of crises would I call who for?
Yes.
And breaking that down gives us an idea of what to do in those moments. Maybe not even when you're having a crisis, but when you notice that other people are, and how are you jumping in to assist other people
Yes.
To the capacity that you have. And so thinking through are there separate professionals who are trained to respond to mental health crises? How do you get in touch with them? Who are they? What are they going to do? Those kind of questions. Are there conflict intervention teams when there's an argument or a fight or something like that? I think we can do some research and figure out what's going on around us.
Yes.
So we can live up to the values that we have and be accountable to ourselves.
Yes.
And our community, our neighbors, when we look at what happens, what exists beyond policing.
I love that idea of doing research and thinking about it in advance, because when a situation is happening, like emotions are high, tensions are high, things are happening, and people naturally, I think, can start to panic. You're not thinking clearly about maybe what it is I can do. So if you can take a moment to think about, okay, if a neighbor is having a fight or something is happening at a place that I'm at, like as you said, what are the resources at my disposal? Who can I call, right? So figure out what those are, put them on your fridge, type them out, print them out, put them on your fridge with a magnet. So okay, in this kind of situation, here's the mental health resources I can call, or the conflict intervention team, as you mentioned, like figuring out what those things are in advance. So in the moment you can say, oh wait, I know what those resources are. Let me go to my fridge. Let me call the number.
Right.
Yeah. As opposed to, naturally defaulting to 911 and calling the police, unless that's fully necessary, which, we're talking about how it might not be.
Yeah. And I think there's so many, it's really hard to do research when you're in that crisis moment, like to say, wait, what are my alternatives to calling somebody here? Yeah. And so having that work done and printed on your fridge or saved in your phone somewhere is a great way to get started.
I think that's a great application, my friend. Very good. All right, well, let's move on to homework. What do we want to do to continue our learning after we leave the table today? I think it would be great to dive into all of the incredible organizations that are featured in this toolkit, especially the ones that serve as case studies. So you mentioned at the top, like at the very end of this thing, there's 4 separate case studies, and we didn't really get a chance to talk about them, so I'm going to name them here. So the first was Dream Defenders, who, as you said, we've engaged with before in this podcast. We read the Healing and Justice Center's annual report, which was brilliant. They're doing such great work down there, and so that was the center of the case study presented it with Dream Defenders. Poder in Action, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correct, who shared lessons and strategies learned from their community mapping efforts. Tyler Salute, again, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, organization based in Puerto Rico. They shared lessons that they've learned from one of their workshops with the cohort. And then the final one was the African American Roundtable, which is actually an organization in Milwaukee that created this inclusive community-based budgeting committee that allowed residents to help consider and fund programs and services that would actually address community safety needs. So I'd love to read through those, click through those organizations' websites, see what they're all about, and learn more about the great work that they're doing. Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, my homework is to review some of those resources that are listed at the end. One of them is Poder in Action.
Yes.
As you mentioned, they participated in the cohort, I believe, And they have a project called the Pueblos Budget, which was created by Large Scale Outreach, which crystallized 4 priorities in their community, which were 1, access to mental health and substance use resources for BIPOC residents. 2 was affordable housing. 3 was resource for parents and caregivers of children. And 4 was resources for BIPOC youth from 14 to 24. So they did a lot of community research. They went out, knocked on doors and said, what are the things that you need, that you feel like we need in the community? And then created a budget for what that might look like based on what the city is currently doing. City or county, I forget. I think they're in Phoenix, Arizona. So, in that area, like they created a budget for how to address these particular needs in the community and get resources to these invaluable things that people need.
Absolutely. That's great. Yeah, there's a lot to learn from all of the folks featured in this thing. So this is this is a toolkit that I think I would love to just revisit. And I think there's a lot more we can learn from it. So great homework, great toolkit. Check it out if you are interested. It is so good. So thank you to our friends over at Interrupting Criminalization for putting it out there in the world. Yeah. All right, my friend, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Next time, I'm bringing a book called Their Borders, Our World, Building New Solidarities with Palestine. This was published by Haymarket Books and is a project from PalFest, which is a Palestinian literature festival. And the Haymarket website describes the book this way. They say it's an anthology of essays that connects Palestinian resistance with global freedom struggles against settler colonialism and calls on us to think more concretely about the practice of solidarity. Each piece grapples with the questions, how do we confront the need to take inevitable and often difficult political stances? How do we make sense of the destruction, uprooting, and pain that we witness? And given our seemingly impossible reality, how is mutuality constructed? So I finished this book a few days ago. It's really thought-provoking and moving and horrifying, but beautiful. Like there's so much in it that is just brilliant, and lots of great people who contributed to it. And I'm really looking forward to talking about it, and because it's given us so much to think about how we confront the settler colonialism that is happening in Palestine, has been happening in Palestine for almost 80 years, and is continuing today in a very violent fashion at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm close to finish with the book, and it's been such an incredible read. So I'm definitely looking forward to talking about it next time. Very good. All right, well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on the socials, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.